Welcome to another episode of the Zelos Podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder. And this week I had it all planned out, man. I had two guests, husband and wife from Springfield College, Adam and Mary Kate Fate, and we had a great conversation, went through the entire hour, and I realized I didn't hit the record button. So, I guess those things happen. First time for everything, even though we're coming up on 100 episodes. We'll chalk that one up to just getting into too good of a conversation. So we're going to get them on next week. This week, I thought instead, I'm going to go back into the vault, into the archives, to the very first episode of the Zelos Podcast, when I invited Mike Boyle on to the show. So sit back. If you haven't heard the very first episode of Zelos, you're about to. Be sure to subscribe. Follow us on Instagram, Rocky_Snyder. And here we go. Welcome to the Zelos Podcast. Rocky Snyder with Mike Boyle. And if you are not familiar with Mike, then you're probably just new to the industry, because Mike's been one of the leaders in the industry for so long. He has a great resume behind him, and he has got an amazing facility in Woburn, Massachusetts. Now, the ironic thing is Mike lives in my hometown, Reading, Massachusetts, and not far away from where I grew up. And the way we pronounce Woburn is Woburn. And so in Woburn, you've got the Mike Boyle strength training facility, and which I've been there. Mike, you may not know, I visited it. You were out of town, or you were out of the facility. I just poked my head in, and man, I am just so impressed with what you've built there. How long have you had it, first of all?
Well, that particular facility is about 12 years old. So we've been there since 2008. We've been in business for 23 or 24 years. We've actually been in really 4 locations, primarily 3, but we were in Winchester for, I think, 10 years prior. And then we were actually in Burlington for a bit. You would remember the old Tennis 128 building was kind of where it started. And then that got sold and torn down, and we ended up by Winchester Tennis Club for about 10 years. And then we've been 12 years in the location that we're in now.
Now, before that, though, you were strength conditioning coach for BU hockey as well as the Boston Bruins. What other kind of history or accolades brought you to basically where you are now?
Well, there's a lot of overlap, because when we were starting out, and you know this because you're a generation younger than I am, but you're still.
You're a handsome man. Thank you. That's nice.
It's true, on both accounts. But my Bruins thing was part-time. I was at BU and I was working for the Bruins both at the same time, because neither one of them was paying me, a full-time salary, a living wage by any stretch of the imagination. So in the 90s, and it was an amazing experience, because obviously you're a Boston guy. I got to work with, Ray Bork and Cam Neely, and I get to meet all the old time Bruins that I grew up watching, as a kid. I got to meet Jerry Cheevers and Don Marcotte and Kenny Hodge, all these guys. So that was a pretty cool experience. In 2012, 2013, I worked for the Red Sox, and that was also a really cool experience, because I got to win a World Series, which was awesome, and be in the dugout for a World Series win, which is something that you don't get to do in every career. There's some guys I know who've spent. Yeah, one of my friends was cursing me because he spent like 20 years in Major League Baseball and he's never won a World Series. He's like, you do 2 years and you win a World Series. So I've been very lucky that I've been able to overlap all these things. And even at BU, I stayed at BU for 30 years. Even when I opened my own business, I kept staying with hockey because Coach Parker wanted me to stay there. So he made it so that I was effectively I was an assistant strength and conditioning coach. I kind of gave up my head strength coach position to my assistant at that time, a guy named Glenn Harris. That was 1997, I think, the year we dropped football. We dropped football in 97. I kind of relinquished my position and became the assistant in 97, and then was just the hockey strength coach, and then was kind of running my own business. So I've had a minimum of 2 jobs up until 2013. In 2013, it was the first time I said, okay, I'm not going to have another gig going on, and I'm just going to run Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning. But in a lot of ways, that doesn't include kind of writing and speaking, so I've never had one job.
Yeah, you're always on the go. Okay, so you tell me about the World Series, which fantastic. I'd love to see the ring sometime. I actually held one of the Red Sox World Series rings because knuckleball pitcher was training with me a little while in the off season or in the facility here. So he came back after the win and kind of let me kind
Ooh,
of look
Stephen
at it.
Wright?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Stephen. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Stephen trained with me for a while too after he got hurt. Stephen's a good guy.
Excellent.
He's had a rough ride, unfortunately, but
Yeah. But that's cool.
he's
Now, here's what I want to know. Beanpot tournament. Not many people outside New England know what the Beanpot is, but we're talking hockey tournament. How many, when you were a BU strength conditioning, how many Beanpot wins, tournament wins did you have?
Oh, I bet 20 out of the 30 years we won it. We were in the final every year but once.
No kidding.
Oh yeah, they took it. They started calling it the Jack Parker Invitational after a while because no matter whether we were good or we were always good during that time period, but we were always in the final game, and I bet we won 20. I'd have to look it up to be certain, but I would not be surprised if we won 20 bean pots in 30 years because we won a bunch. We had a couple of strings of 4 in a row where classes didn't lose a bean pot during their time at BU. At least one, and I think 2 groups of kids never lost one.
So it was BC, BU, Harvard, and was it Northeastern?
Northeastern. Yep, and Northeastern actually has won twice, I think, in the last 3 years after winning only once since the 80s. They won one, in 80 something, and then didn't win for a really long time. If you get the BU BC final on that second Monday night, the place is just packed to the gills. It's the social event of the season. If you're a business person in Boston, you want to be at the Beanpot and be seen and talk to people. Sometimes there aren't enough people in the seats because people are so busy socializing.
Socializing, yeah, that's what we used to call it too. So
yes,
you've made this transition pretty well from obviously very hockey centric to so many other sports. Of course, in your facility, you get a lot of the pros and the aspiring athletes coming in, and not just with, of course, Bruins, but you got Red Sox, potentially Celtics. I'm not sure if you had any Celtics players training with you. I wouldn't be surprised if you did. Of course, Patriots are there. But beyond that, Olympic athletes, it seems like, for many in the Northeast, this is the place to train. You've really built up quite a process there. And it's an amazing system that you have developed. And I'm sure it's a system that's in process and you're always kind of tweaking it. And I'm curious, what are some of the tweaks that you've recently made with conditioning and with your facility? Are there any standouts?
Well, the big standout is just the COVID adaptations that we've had to make. We've had to move to what we would call a pod system. I was in there. I had a lacrosse player actually from not far from you, from I think Appleton, which is near Palo Alto, near Stanford.
Yeah.
Was in today, and I was showing them. We've always had sort of an assembly line kind of approach, but now we've had to really make assembly line socially distanced. So we have had, our warm-up area is 12-foot wide lanes, and we've got 12-foot wide lanes for 8 people. So we've got almost 8,000 square feet for warm-up so that we can do our warm-up, our speed work, our plyos, all that stuff, but everybody's in their own lane. Nobody touches anybody else. The weight room is basically 24 14 by 14 pods that we've set up. So we've got 8 Olympic lifting stations and 8 kind of dumbbell stations and then 8 racks. And we've had to establish even a more distinct rotation than we ever had to before. Before we could kind of let people wander around a little bit. And now it's literally the definition of staying in your lane, like stay in your lane. You can't get out of your lane. You've got to, you've got to be able to follow this process. So that's been the biggest thing. But other things that we've changed, I think we've really changed our speed development program. I've been very heavily influenced by a guy named Tony Holler, who is was a high school track coach in Illinois, just retired last year. If I showed you a picture of Tony Holler, you'd say, no wonder you like him. He looks like you. He's 61 years old, balding with glasses. It's like, okay, my kind of guy. But he wrote an article that someone had sent me called Record, Rank, and Publish, and basically said that if you're trying to develop speed, but you're not timing your athletes, you're not going to develop speed. And it was a little bit of a head scratcher for me because I was like, well, we sprint, we jump, we lift, we do all this stuff. But I can honestly say I was never happy with our speed results. I would say I was not unhappy, but I never thought like, oh my God, we're doing an unbelievable job. We're killing this.
Gotcha.
And so we started timing. And timing has become a huge part of what we're doing. So we time everybody twice a week in some type of flying 10-yard dash.
And do you use that as an assessment, like a metric or parameter to know what their volume intensity should be?
This is what's interesting, is that I think what we've done with sprinting is we've undervalued sprinting as an actual training tool. I think we saw sprinting as a test, something that we do to measure, like you said, oh, where are we? But I don't think we've looked at the idea of moving consistently at 8 meters a second or in that neighborhood is a really powerful. I listened to your podcast with Anthony. When you think about gait and you think about movement, trying to get someone to move as fast as they can, we have found, and this has been my last year of talks, to be very self-organizational. It's like the act of sprinting teaches sprinting, because when someone sprints against the clock, they get very direct feedback. Was that good or bad? Right. And then if they try something else, they get very direct feedback. Was that better or worse? We're looking at, and it's one of the things that Tony Pollard had said, was that his sprinters that play football lift, his sprinters that don't play football don't lift. He said, I don't think lifting has a lot to do with getting faster. And that, all of this stuff was very thought-provoking for me, because I when I went back and created a presentation, one of the things I did is I talked about like Carl Lewis and Ben Johnson. One guy, Johnson, an avid weightlifter and a steroid guy, and everybody talked about his lifts, 600 something squat, 365 bench press, blah, blah, blah. Lewis, kind of disdainful of the weight room, and never spoke at all at length about the weight room or about what his lifts were or how he did. And yet they were almost identical sprinters in terms of time. They dominated the races and were within hundredths of a second of each other almost every race they were in. And I said, the common denominator there is sprinting.
Yeah.
So you had one guy who wasn't a big weightlifter, one guy who was a big weightlifter. So obviously the strength coaches in us all became kind of Ben Johnson, Charlie Francis guys. Like, that's the way to do it. It was confirmation bias. It made it agreed with what we did. But I started to look at that and think, wow, maybe that's not the answer that we thought it was. And maybe sprinting is the real answer. So we've made sprinting a really central part of what we're doing. So that's another really significant change. The other thing, and then he said conditioning, we're doing a lot less conditioning. Because again, the kids, we're seeing a lot of high school, middle school kids who are really overscheduled to begin with. We used to really be conditioning fanatics and, running shuttles and riding the bike and doing slide board and doing all this stuff, trying to get our kids in shape. But now, like, when I start looking at my son and his friends, they probably average 7 1-hour sessions a week of low intensity conditioning and or games, basically practice. When I look at my son, there's 2 hockey practices a week. There's 1 lacrosse practice a week. There's generally at least 1 lacrosse game. And there's generally 2 hockey games, in their fall kind of preparation season. Those kids don't need a lot of conditioning.
Right.
They probably need you to fill the top end with sprinting and maybe some 10-second interval stuff, some really high intensity stuff. But we've gotten away from the kind of older energy system approach of, hey, let's get these guys in shape. So those have been the 3 big changes.
That's interesting. And you mentioned the Olympic lifts, and you've got your 8 stations in the pods and everything. And I understand the use and why we utilize Olympic lifting, that explosive vertical displacement, full body action, and the sprinting. Of course, now we've got, just like you mentioned, the gait mechanics at full bore, and they'll clean up themselves to some degree. But the thing that I've gotten away from, and the thing that I've really just really liked hearing you say is how you've also gotten away from a lot of the bilateral or sagittal plane biased movements. I mean, it all depends upon the athlete. Granted, if they're going to be a power lifter, then they need to do power lifts. And if they're going to be competitive in bodybuilding, then they need to do a bodybuilding program. But so many programs up until this point, probably I'd say maybe 5 to 10 years ago, were looking like bodybuilding programs and powerlifting programs. For any sport, we would just select a movement that kind of resembled what they were doing on a court or a pitch or ice or something. But you've recently said, we do a lot more unilateral training. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Like, you came out some time ago to the chagrin of others and you said, we don't squat. I don't have people squat. And I think people ran with that and to any degree they can. But I'd love to just talk about the concept of minimizing a parallel squat and the utilization of single leg or unilateral strength training. What do you got to say about
Yeah.
that?
One of the things it's hard to imagine, but that statement was 2009. It was 11 years ago that I said, we're done squatting. And as you said, we were in a lot of ways conventional. We did what everybody else did. We did back squats and we did bench press and we were always hang clean people. We never Olympic lifted from the floor. I never went that direction. But I was very heavily influenced in the beginning by guys like Vern and then eventually guys like Gary Gray. And as I started to understand functional anatomy, I had this conversation yesterday with someone on another podcast. My idea of functional training is the application of what we know about functional anatomy to training. And what we know about functional anatomy tells us that things are very different in unilateral stance. And as I've studied this more, I think that bilateral stance actually probably makes you a worse athlete. If you look at, if bilateral training did what we think it did, and I've said this numerous times, there'd be a lot more power lifters in the Olympics because we've become very strength focused and we've got this idea that the more strength we have, the better we're going to be. And I look at that and think, then why aren't these guys that are the strongest men in the world the best athletes in the world? And I think in some ways, neurologically, like, you said, when you think about gait and opposition and all these things that we're doing, bilateral training, we feel like when you look at the bilateral deficit idea, unilateral training is limiting. The body does not like bilateral activity. It's not natural. And it's a really hard thing for people to accept, but I think it's true. And there have been studies when you look into kind of the bilateral deficit stuff. Some people think that you actually self-limit in bilateral exercise because of that, because it's neurologically confusing. The body doesn't feel right when it does it. And we find that like our guys, when we do unilateral training, when you really start to explore unilateral strength training, what you see is, particularly with the lower body, the bilateral deficit is so incredibly obvious. And you start to realize that, it's Kevin Carr that works with me had a great analogy. He said, the way the strength training field is, it's like in strength training, if someone said, you can have a Big Mac and it's $5, or you can have a half a Big Mac for $2. And there are some people like, no, I don't want mine cut in half. I'm willing to pay $1 more to have the whole Big Mac instead of, give me the 2 halves and saving $1. Like that's not. And, I guess I coined the term myself the other day. I talked about the orthopedic cost of exercise. And I think in what we would call conventional training, the orthopedic cost can be extremely high in terms of the wear and tear. And we see that because a lot of the people that disagreed with me in 2009, the go heavy or go home kind of hardo types, a lot of those guys have now come around. I have a group of guys that I've become friendly with, and I call them the charter members of the I used to think Mike Boyle was a pussy club, because these are guys who in 2009 made fun of me, and now in 2020 are coming out in podcasts and saying, wow, I used to think Mike Boyle was such a pussy. I used to think he was, he was a joke, talking about unilateral training. And now I realize either their own experience or through their athlete experience, I was right. And I tell everybody, I said, you're all going to realize I'm right. It's just going to be a matter of time. I have the advantage of 40 years almost in the field. I'm in year 39 and longer of actually coaching, because I was coaching powerlifters when I was in college. So I've been coaching people for more than 40 years. And I started out as a competitive powerlifter. I've been down that bilateral road,
right?
And I've suffered for it, back pain, shoulder surgery, knee problems. I've had, all kinds. I mean, I used to have 25 years of back pain.
Yeah. That should scream something for most people, right?
Right. But the problem is it screams, get it fixed so you can do it again. And I have so many of these sort of, I said, I'm an analogist. I love analogies. And it's slamming your hand in a car door. And I said, if you slammed your hand in a car door and broke 4 of your fingers and told me that you couldn't wait for your fingers to heal so you could again slam them in a car door, I would not think you were very bright. But that's the approach of a lot of lifters. It's amazing to hear someone say, "Oh, I ruptured a disc in my back," and I literally have a guy that I blocked on Twitter the other day because he's doing Squattober on his replaced hip. He's talking about, hopefully I hope I get back my squat technique in time for Squattober. And I'm thinking like you had a hip replacement, you had to get a joint replaced, and it probably had something to do with squatting. Why would you go back to that activity? Why would you not try to find, a more joint friendly activity, an activity with a lower orthopedic cost that might get you the same, or in my case, I think greater benefit? That's the difference now, because when you think about the idea of function, and when you said, we get on, unilateral training, we get on one leg, suddenly now, quadratus lumborum becomes a stabilizer, glute medius becomes a stabilizer, adductors become a stabilizer. All these muscles have to stabilize in unilateral stance. They're kind of just hanging out in bilateral stance. They're not doing a whole lot when you're squatting, because they don't need to.
No.
You've got the
frontal and transverse plane go on. There's just a gag order placed on 2 dimensions of space, because all you're concerned with really is flexion extension.
Right. And I tell everybody that unilateral exercise is triplanar.
Yes.
Because as soon as you put yourself on one foot, you are now forced to stabilize in the frontal plane, and you're forced to stabilize in the transverse plane. Exactly. And so even if you did sagittal exercise, like a lot of our stuff is still primarily sagittal, except it's not. When you really look at function and you say, okay, well, what's your glute medius supposed to do? Well, it's not an abductor. It's really a pelvic stabilizer. Its intention is to keep your pelvis at a certain height in unilateral stance, and it's going to be helped by your QL on the other side. So, you've kind of got like basically 2 hangers, one of them's pulling up, one of them's pulling down, the pelvis stays where it is.
Yeah.
That's the function of that muscle in frontal plane stability. When you think about hip rotators, and I always say, you think about glutes, I always talk about glutes and adductors. Adductors are internal rotators, glutes are external rotators. The neutralizing effect of an adductor acting, adductor magnus acting as extensor, glute max acting as extensor, is a net cancellation of the rotary forces, right? And so you go forward. But that's a triplanar activity, because you've got something trying to pull you in one direction and something having to pull you in the opposite direction in order to make you go straight. These are kind of unique things that we don't see in a mechanical model like a car.
No, and they're braking mechanisms, right? They're going to help in decelerating the forces when you go into pronation. So when we're talking about movement compared to single leg stance exercises, we're going to see, yes, they're stabilizers when you're balancing on one leg, but as soon as you put that body in motion, it is going to be all about reducing ground forces and then loading into that tissue to propel you to the next stage.
Right. And I remember the old NASM stuff used to talk about, movers, stabilizers, neutralizers, and you've got to be able to look at something and think. So, you can, your glute medius would be a stabilizer, but your adductor magnus and your glute max would have neutralizer functions, because they'd be canceling out their rotational moments so that you didn't run, in abduction. And then, so even in function, hamstring, I always thought, we're working on eccentric hamstring function, because it's the same thing. The hamstring has a huge eccentric function during the swing phase. As I kind of show people, like, what we would call like drum major running, where you're running and letting your legs kick out in front of you. I said, that's what you'd run like if your hamstrings didn't work.
There you go.
But you don't, because your hamstring acts as an eccentric, or if you listen to Franz Bosch, isometric, but in either way, it's a brake. In the swing phase, you've got a muscle that's actually functioning again. It's a neutralizer. It's trying to prevent leg extension. You look at that and think, and people really, you get it because you understand function, but a lot of times you try to talk to people about this and they just kind of look at you with that sort of blank look, like, huh?
Well, I think that's because that's the way we were taught how muscles work from a concentric model. We were always looking at a hamstring that it's a hip extensor or a knee flexor, because we were taught that's how a muscle works, is through shortening. But through movement, it's so much more eccentric loading with a very short concentric component. So really, for me, like you say, a hamstring is going to decelerate forward leg swing. So we're talking about hip flexion and knee extension. and that hamstring is going to work in different components depending upon which position the pelvis is in. Like that's the one thing. I don't want to go on a side note, but we talk about hamstring stretching, and most people are going to try and extend their leg out to extend the knee, which will lengthen that hamstring. But then the pelvis, when we look at how a body moves, that pelvis should be posteriorly tilting because of the mass of that leg swinging forward. But everyone's been taught to tilt the pelvis forward, and then next to you got this screaming, burning hamstring stretch, all because we've looked at an anatomy book the wrong way. So just to go off on a tangent to the side.
No, we always, I'm constantly talking to people when we talk about functional training about the idea of sort of dead person anatomy versus live person anatomy. I remember my first Gary Gray course, and I feel badly because I feel like Gary in some ways has lost his way and has gone a little bit, is a little bit too out there now. But in the 90s, the things that he was saying were, it was like atom splitting in terms of he was, talking about the ideas and people just were looking, going, I mean, I can remember I always remember the people, the meathead types, the bodybuilders that would be in the audience would just be shaking their head.
Yeah, exactly.
Or the old single joint physical therapists, the people who were isokinetic people. I still argue with the isokinetic people to this day about like, I would never do a leg extension. I'm like, there's no point to do a leg extension. And I'm like, there's no point to do a leg curl, lying leg curl. I said, those are completely useless exercises. And I'll get physical therapists who will be adamant about, an ACL rehab, you've got to do short arc quads. And I'm like, I mean, that muscle, why would you bother asking a muscle to do something that function never does and neurologically it never does, exactly. And then wonder why the person has patellofemoral complication. And you say, well, you have patellofemoral complication because you've created an axis of rotation that's totally wrong. And I always say, I have, like I said, I have all my standard cliches. I'm like, the only guy who needs leg extension is a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest. You know what I mean? Like there's not a lot of times that would be functional. And I always say to people, like, how often do you think, I'm going to kick my own ass? I'm going to kick myself in the ass. I'm going to lay on the floor and try to kick myself in the butt. And you kind of look and think, probably never. Like, I don't think that. And you're like, right, exactly, never. Like that never happens. That muscle never does that. So there's absolutely no rational reason for you to do it.
No. The reason those came out was just aesthetic purposes to build a muscle's hypertrophy for bodybuilding, right?
Exactly.
But it doesn't carry over to actual real world movements. Now speaking of real world too, because I could freaking rage on that topic all day long with you, with mechanized PT and all that. But here's something that I don't think we talk enough about is the structural degradation in terms of structural integrity with every passing generation that walks into our training facilities. And how are we accommodating that? Meaning that we've got now COVID, obviously, so you got a lot of kids and adults that are online sitting on their asses and just for hours and hours a day while their body conforms and adapts to that environment. And then they think magically there's a reset button that's going to pull them back into proper alignment, and they're going to go to the gym and everything's going to work according to plan as the way that the exercise was designed to be performed. But most of the people that are coming in, because you've been doing it for about 40, I've been doing it for about 30. Those people that we are training at the early onset of our careers were structurally more sound than most people that walk into our gyms today, including the top level athletes. And yet I believe personally, and I'll throw out a blanket statement, we load too soon for most people. They don't own the movement before most load is put on. And that just sends them into improper patterns, compensation, and you want to talk about an orthopedic bill or cost of that, that's going to send it to the ceiling. So I'm curious, how are you addressing that?
Well, I think one, we always like with our kids, when we have our kids in the gym, I always tell our coaches, I don't care if these kids get strong. I care if they know how to lift. So we definitely don't load too soon. If anything, the criticism of us with our athletes is too conservative. Yeah, I said, so with our adults, we used to always say body weight before external resistance, but I've modified that to the point of body weight, lower body exercise before external resistance, and external resistance, upper body exercise before body weight exercise. So if you look at it and think most of our adults are not capable of a push-up or a chin-up, but they're very capable of a bodyweight squat or a bodyweight split squat or a reaching one leg straight leg deadlift type of motion. So we've, again, we are low loaders. We're the criticism of us, like I said, is that we're too conservative. We don't push people hard enough, that kind of thing. But as you said, most people that you look at are not ready. And most adults, like I look at most adults and think they should probably never do conventional strength training. Our adults don't bench press. We do not do a barbell bench press ever with our adults. No one squats with a bar on their back. Very, very few. Like we'll do some kettlebell sumo style deadlifting in the beginning, but we don't really progress it. We never get to we don't do anything that people would equate with heavy conventional strength training. I don't let our adults Olympic lift. I always say adults make crappy Olympic lifters. There's too much water under the bridge for an adult to become a capable Olympic lifter. Yet, if you flip the coin around, our kids all bench press, our kids all deadlift, our kids all, do relatively heavy goblet squats, our kids all Olympic lift, because I feel like it's kind of the ABC effect. These kids need to learn the fundamentals of the weight room. Whereas the adults, you're probably past that point. Like you can't teach them the fundamentals of the weight room. They've undergone too much negative change. But, it's like you can't get the toothpaste back in the tube. You can certainly train an adult and get them better. But to take them back to these sort of beginner remedial strength training exercises is probably a mistake, particularly if you continue to load them. And you'll end up like CrossFit. You'll end up with tons of injured people who are addicted to exercise and in the probably truest sense are addicted to injuring themselves.
Yeah, and here I sit in Santa Cruz, the home of CrossFit itself, but we'll pass over that. The thing that we do with the adults is we look for what we'll coin the dark zones. Where is it they don't move well into? Because those are the areas that are restricted, that are limiting their potential. And I want to be able to access these places because it will create a chain reaction all the way through their body to make them more resilient. And so instead of really loading them heavily, like you say, I actually really like what you just said about we get them to do lower body movements, unloaded, lower body movements. When it comes to upper body, we generally load those with bands and dumbbells because they can't handle their own body weight, but we get them to handle their own body weight in their legs first. That's a nice kind of paradigm there that I really appreciate. And I gotta say, I continually run into problems with people that have expectations that you're coming here to train and therefore you have to lift a dumbbell or a barbell. But if we put them into positions that they do not move into very well, it kicks their butt. And they are blown away by how we can tap into those weak spots and actually how it transfers into their golf swing, their tennis, their running. It's remarkable. So where are you going here? And you've got Perform Better. I've thoroughly enjoyed over the years listening to all your presentations there. And of course, you've got the Strength Coach podcast where there's some great insight and information there. But through the COVID waters and kind of navigating through this and hopefully on to new horizons, do you have plans? Where do you see everything going?
It's interesting. We're planning that it's never going to go back, only because I think that's the way that you have to plan to be able to move forward. This is how we're going to train for, the rest of the time that we're here. We're trying to develop a business model that will work with social distancing, no matter what else happens. And we were very lucky in that, we were in the online space prior to this. We had just moved our certification online, which was something I didn't want to do, and now ends up being one of the smartest things that we've done in terms of we partnered with these guys at Inspire 360 and got a really good version of our cert online. We filmed the entire cert. We filmed Kevin Carr teaching an entire cert. So anybody that watches it really has to watch the whole seminar as if they were there, and they have to submit a video practical. So, they get everything that they would get if they had done it live. But they can do it from anywhere in the world, and they can do it during this time. And that's, in all honesty, it saved that business. That business would have just ceased to exist during
What was
COVID. And instead, we've, our numbers are as good probably as when we were doing live events.
what was your reluctance of taking it online? I'm just curious.
I just felt like it cheapened it. I felt like it would just be another cert that, you could pay for, because I feel like that's what happens now, is that you just buy letters. It's kind of like playing Scrabble where you purchase the letters. So you can just, oh, I want, CFSC. Okay, that's $800. If I pay my $800, I get it, because you just, it's all sort of attendance points, really. And I didn't want it to be that way. And so, one of the things that we did is you have to pass the pre-test before you can take the course. So we send you out the study material. If you don't get a passing grade on the pre-test, you can't access the course until you've gotten the passing grade on the pre-test. So we did that to eliminate what I call, and you would know, the seminar killer, the person who shows up for the seminar and is woefully unprepared and asks a million questions because they don't know the material. And they ruin the seminar, right? Like, you have that person here and you think you shouldn't be here because you're not ready for this, but they want to get their, whatever, their $500 worth. So they're going to slow this thing down to a snail's pace. So we kind of eliminate that person from the beginning. And then what we do is we always had a practical at the end. You have to pass the practical. So not only do you have to know the information, but you actually have to be able to move. You've been at Perform Better seminars, and one of the things we realized is that there are people, whatever, certified personal trainers, who can't skip. And I think that's a problem. If you're supposedly a teacher of movement, and I look at you and you do like the Frankenstein skip where you're same arm, same leg, I'm thinking either you've got a really severe neurological problem or you just don't move very well. In either case, I don't want you teaching my athletes when you can't skip. And we teach like skipping and crossover skipping and a lot of this stuff. And you look, and I mean, it looks like a Chinese arithmetic class with some of these people trying to figure out how to skip and side skip and crossover skip. And, and we're trying to teach hopping and jumping. And I mean, but we want these people, like, you got to be able to do it. If you can't do it, you can't teach it, or I won't say you can't teach it, because I've kind of railed against that in my own world, but it's going to be much harder if you're not at least an effective demonstrator. I don't think you have to be strong. I always say that. I think, I don't look the part anymore. I'm not the type of guy that you look at and go, oh, wow, he's a strength coach. That might be last on the list of professions. If I get, if we played What's My Line and I stood there in front of people, there's no chance that anybody's going with strength coach for me.
Well, I'm aspiring to look just like you later in life there, in that 5 or 10 year gap that we have between us. I got the glasses. I'm just not wearing them right now. And the haircut's coming along pretty well, at least on the top here. So, yeah, I got you.
Yeah. All you got to do is cut it all off. That's the key. Once you do it, you'll be liberated. You'll never want hair again. And whenever people say to me about getting hair transplants, I'm like, who the hell would want hair? It's absolutely the most overrated accessory in the history of men.
Pain in the ass. And so
Yep.
you've got an amazing internship program in your facility. And aside from the certifications that you have, how does that work for like the listening audience that are maybe not even in the Northeast, but maybe willing to travel there and they want to apply to be an intern? How would that work for getting over to Woburn?
Well, it's interesting. Ours is always different than everybody else's. One, they have to go online and apply, which everybody does. But the big thing with us is you have to send a video. Because the thing that I realized after a couple of years of doing this was that on occasion, we purchased a few potted plants, but they weren't going to make very good coaches. And it was because they looked really good on paper. They had great resumes. They did great in school. They were really smart, but they weren't capable of coaching anybody. So then after we had a couple of these just total disasters where people showed up and, obviously the person who's selecting the interns always said, but you should see their resume. Their recommendations were unbelievable. Their resume was unbelievable. And I started to think, okay, one thing we have to realize from a collegiate standpoint is we can't trust resumes and we can't trust recommendations. I always feel like if your teachers really liked you, you're probably not my ideal intern. Because the best ones I've had, sometimes one of the best female interns I ever had, her teachers literally said to me, she was a Springfield College girl, and her teacher said, I don't know, she doesn't like school very much. She needs to do an internship. I don't know if you're going to like her. she worked her ass off. She came from a family, that had done construction, and she was a worker. And she was a great coach. She just wasn't good in school. And I started to realize, okay, I don't need people that are good in school. I need people that are good with people. And so now it's a video. You have to explain on video why you want to be an intern at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning. And you'd better project some personality, because if you don't, you won't get the internship. If I get this monotone, I want to be an intern at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning because I really like working out and I have really big muscles and I can bench press 300 pounds. You're like, that guy's, he gets deleted. Everything gets, his file, his video, everything gets deleted. But if we had one girl who literally jumped out of a box, like the video started, with pointing at like this big carton, and she came like springing out of the carton. I was like, okay, she's in. I don't know when I've asked her, like, where's she from? Where'd she go to school? Was she a phys ed major? What was she? I said, but I want the girl that came out of the box, because if you look at that and think, this is someone who's bright, creative, energetic. And that's what we need in our field. I always say to people, and I've said that it gets to be cliche with me, but I always say I can make you smarter, but I can't make you nicer. I can't give you a personality transplant, but I can make you learn the material, and at least enough of the material where you'll be an adequate coach. You may never be the thinker behind the program, but you don't have to be. You can be, the assembly line worker who's implementing the program, and you may never really get a great grasp on why we're doing what we're doing.
That's great. Because I feel the same way when people come in with certifications and resumes. That first tells me, okay, just enough to be dangerous to the people that are here, right?
And irritating.
Yes. And I don't really care what you know, because you're going to learn what it is I want you to know. And if you happen to have some of that information, great. But you better be able to motivate, stimulate, and get people to do things that they may not want to do, first of all, or maybe they do, but you got to make them do it better. So the coaches that stand out are never the ones that came in necessarily with the 4.0 and the gleaming resume. They're the ones, actually, clients who have been with us for years have at some point in time been encouraged, hey, go ahead and get your certification so you can hang that up on the wall, but we want you to coach here because you've been through this, you know how it works, and you're a living embodiment of the change that can occur. And we want you to be a symbol of that here too. So have you had clients yourself that have turned around and become
we do. We have a couple that are working for us right now. I mean, we have one woman who is a legitimate genius. I mean, the MIT grad, has founded her own company and is working for us now because she loves the fitness field. And, she's awesome, but, it's, sometimes I feel bad, but she loves it. So yeah, we've definitely had people like that. And sometimes with us, it's athletes too. Sometimes I'll have athletes and think, this is what you should be doing. When when your career is over, you're going to make a really good coach. And so, some of my first interns and coworkers and people like that were just our former athletes who had some inclination that they wanted to coach. And I sort of coerced them into coming and working with me in the business. So we've had a bunch of those too. So it's been very good.
Very cool.
I want to go back because I know we're not going to have that much time. When you talk about the unilateral stuff, I just want to mention there's a guy named Alex Natera, who is an Australian rules football coach, who did, and this is the stuff that we've been playing with this summer when you talk about things that are different, but they did some research. He was at, I think it's called Aspire, depending on how you choose to pronounce it, but they did research on looking at squatting versus single leg squatting. And in his research, so it's super interesting, two things. One, he started to look at what percentage of your body weight are you squatting when you actually single leg squat. And I don't know, have you read Range, David Epstein's new book, Range?
Yes, I have.
Okay. So in Range, he talks about the idea of undiscovered connections, right? That's one of the things that they highlight in the book. The undiscovered connection in unilateral training is that this guy goes to a study on pilots to try to determine how much weight is in your torso. Because when they were looking at seats, and being in the plane and that kind of stuff, they determined basically that I think it was 64% of your weight was torso from from your butt up, whatever was in the seat was 64% of your body weight on average. So that leaves you, no, 68, because it leaves you 32 for your lower body. 32% is your lower body, which means that each leg individually is 16%. So if you take 16% and 68, you get 84% of your body weight when you do a single leg squat. That's what you're going to single leg squat with.
Gotcha.
Not half of your body weight, but 84% of your body weight, right? So what they did with those numbers is they then looked at force plate numbers, and they realized that, so if you could do a body weight single leg squat, you were effectively a body weight back squatter. So, if I weigh 180, if I can do a single leg squat, that means I could squat 180.
Gotcha.
If I can squat 50% of my body weight, so if I can do a single leg squat with 90 pounds, whatever, dumbbells, chains, vest, whatever it is, I'm a double body weight squatter. If I can do 100% of my body weight in single leg squat, I'm a triple body weight squatter. 100% of your body weight is tough, but we're really pushing with our athletes now to get to that 50% number, because that's the number for a lot of times when people said, well, how strong is strong enough? People, double body weight back squat, strong enough. So now I'm like, okay, 0.5 body weight single leg squat then, based on Alex's data, is strong enough. And so we're trying to push our athletes up into that area. And it's been giving us it's great because it gives us some target.
Sure.
In the summer, I start looking at guys and thinking, okay, I got guys that weigh 200. You got to get to 100. You got to be able to single leg squat, whatever. If we're looking at 100, maybe it's like, okay, 80 for 3 or 85 pounds for 3, whatever it is. And, that'll give you a 1 RM of 100, and that'll give you that double body weight squat number that we're looking for. So that's one of the things that we've started to do that is, I think, really interesting, because I do believe in strength. And I think that's where people get confused when you start talking about unilateral training. People think, well, you don't strength train.
Yeah.
And I want people to understand that's not the case with us at all. If you come in, people are always surprised at our gym at how strong everybody is, because they are always, oh, I thought you were like a functional guy, and they equate functional with weak. Like, oh, I thought you were like a weak dumbbell waving guy. And I'm like, I'm not a weak dumbbell waving guy. But I do believe in this idea of applying functional anatomy to training. And that means, particularly from a lower body standpoint, unilateral training, like upper body, I can make a lot of cases for bilateral upper body training, because in sports, there are lots of situations where you get 2 hands on somebody and push them. Sure. Like you would in a bench pressing type situation. That's not uncommon in sport. But when you say, how often in sport does somebody run on 2 legs? You're like, no, you can't do that. Like, that's not possible, right? There's no 2-legged running. That would be like jumping, really. Right. And, I would say it's like, rabbits jump, people hop, really, because, people are going to be purely unilateral. And, I tell people, the only people that are bilateral are rowers. They occupy almost a completely unique position in the sports world, because they really are bilateral. But right. Everybody else, except if you're thinking about, race car drivers or something, but there's very few people that are going to be doing something that is in essence primarily bilateral. People will argue, well, in basketball, yeah, you may jump occasionally off 2 legs. In volleyball, you may jump occasionally off 2 legs. But if you really look at the number of times that actually happens, it's really low.
Yeah, with the whole functional thinking that they're weak, we've got one woman just came in not too long ago. She's been training with us on a regular basis throughout the week. And what we do is functional training. It's really dependent upon a person's posture and their gait patterns that dictate what they're going to be lifting and the dark zones we're going to try and expose. But she went to some UFC gym up in the Bay Area and for some group workout, and it was just super high intensity, and she kept right with them, and people were just looking at her because she was just busting it out, and said, so what CrossFit gym or what UFC do you belong to? She's like, no, I don't. I just go to this little hole in the wall in Santa Cruz, and we don't do any of this exercise. It's kind of neat, but no, we don't do any of this stuff. So the carryover has just been phenomenal. But we're totally up against the clock here, Mike, and I really appreciate your time and hanging back with me. And I honestly wish I was in Reading right now. We could run up to Kitty's restaurant, get a nice Italian lunch or something. They're still around, aren't they? Is Kitty's around?
They're still there, yeah, they are.
Forever
Great pizza.
and ever.
They have outstanding pizza, which is not something you would expect Kitties to have.
Maybe I'll order some online and see if they'll deliver. I don't know. But next time, I'm honestly, my folks, my family lives up on Hampton, New Hampshire there, right at the North Beach there at the wall. I go and surf there when I'm visiting. But now I got another place to knock on the door, and I hope you answer next time I'm in town. But I really appreciate your time here. And I don't know when Perform Better is what's going to happen next year, but I hope our paths cross real soon.
Well, I hope the same. We can get to meet in person. Thank you.
And that's a wrap for the Zelos Podcast. Got to say thanks to Mike Boyle, strength coach. Check out all of his stuff online, and the Strength Coach Podcast with Anthony Renna and Mike. Definitely something, if you're not familiar with, get over there. And if you need some equipment, be sure to check out performbetter.com. And we'll see you next week with Adam and Mary Kate Fate. I promise. We'll record it this time.